Well, welcome everyone. This is the third in the series of AI in construction. Two out of the twice a quarter, I want to have folks on that can talk to us about real workflows, things that people are actually doing. And then once a quarter, I'll do something that's a little more of a deep dive into the tech itself, which will be next month. So today, I wanted to go into contract docs and how AI is helping with that. So some of you who follow the podcast will know that I did a podcast with Dan Broderick, who's the founder and CEO of Blackboiler. Dan, I was really impressed in our conversations, both on the podcast and before it, about how much he really is deep into the tech itself. So I thought we could have ourselves a conversation that not only talks about how stuff's really being used, but also dig into some of the decisions that get made when you're making a real product. It's easy to jump straight to the big LLMs and pay OpenAI a lot of money, but you don't always have to do that. We'll get into that a little bit later. So, Dan, why don't you start with a little overview of what got you to Black Boiler? Because I think it's nice that you've got a pretty cool series of jobs that got you there. And we'll talk a little bit about what you guys do.
Yeah, so my background, my education is in engineering and management, with a concentration in construction management. And then I went and I worked for Whiting Turner for about 3 years as a project engineer. And after that, I went to law school. I went to law school, and while I was in law school, I was actually a schedule claims delay consultant, and was in law school at the same time. Got done with law school and went to work for Wateter Hoffman Fitzgerald, which is a construction litigation firm, decently well known in the Northern Virginia area. Practice in that area. Eventually was wound up at Kilpatrick Townsend, and when I was at Kilpatrick, I was seconded to a client where I would go to their offices to review and negotiate a lot of contracts. So I was given what essentially was a playbook, what they call in it's like a rule set for how you're supposed to be reviewing and marking up contracts. And I would make very similar edits to very similar documents over and over again. But I was often working on counterparty paper, but I was hitting the same issues and making almost the same edits to almost the same language over and over again. I wasn't super, I didn't feel like I was practicing law at the top of my license when I was doing that. It's like very kind of same thing over and over again. It's not all that engaging. And so I thought that, we would be able to automate the process of reviewing those documents and marking them up. At the time, when I first kind of, issues first started hitting me, it was like 2014, 2015. And that was kind of like the last explosion in kind of when the last AI explosion really kind of took off was like 14, 15 time period. There's some couple of like big papers that came out at that time. And I was watching other people in the market doing interesting things with contracts. A lot of it was about in the due diligence aspect during an M&A transaction, where they just need to know what contracts have like a change of control provision and what contracts might be subject to notice if there's going to be an assignment or anything like that. And so I was eventually connected to Blackboiler's now co-founder and CTO, Jonathan Herr, and we developed Blackboiler, which is software that automates the review and markup of contracts by learning from how our clients review and edit documents in the past. So we train our system. Our key insight was that we could train our system on historical work product. So typically when you negotiate contracts, you're going back and forth with the counterparty in a Word document, in-track changes. And our insight was, well, that's all a bunch of annotated data. And that annotated data can be used to create machine learning and artificial intelligence models. And so that's how we initially started Blackboiler. And we got their initial funding through the National Science Foundation under an SBIR grant, and that was in 2017. And then we were in R&D for a while until about 2020 or so, and then we took the product to market. So that's my background here, a little bit long-winded, but that's what I do. We have a specific concentration in the AEC space. There's some unique aspects of contracting in AEC that is unusual. The first is that almost always, like if you're a on a large project or you're a commercial contractor, you're almost always signing counterparty paper, which is a little bit unique. That's not true in other industries where you're typically, if I'm selling our Blackboiler software, most of the time I'm selling it on our paper. I'm sending out our contract. And so there's a huge pain point in construction and the fact that you're looking almost entirely at third-party paper or counterparty paper. And that's what we specialize in, is being able to handle those counterparty documents.
So I'm going to key on something you said a moment ago, because I think it generalizes a little bit as folks on the call and otherwise think about how they may or may not use their own or create their own AI. You talked about how redline documents are effectively annotated, which is, this isn't really the modern LLM where you can do some other things. This is, you guys started before the ChatGPT and all that, where typically people needed to have examples that had labels on them, so otherwise known as supervised learning. So you realized, oh my gosh, we have the inputs for supervised learning. Presumably you had to do some things to make them so the columns lined up and the data was prepped properly. But how were you able to get enough data? Because the other thing you hear, the two things you hear in construction all the time is our data's a mess, it's in PDFs and so on, and we can't get enough of it. You're not even a contractor, so it wasn't like you could say, grab everything we've done for the last 10 years. Did you use an existing model and kind of fine tune it? Did you build something? How'd you guys cover that?
Well, I'll start by saying that we have several different types of models we refer to it as a text processing pipeline, because it's not like we have a single algorithm that we just use. We use an algorithm and we're done. So we have this whole pipeline of processes that have to happen to get from a unedited document to an edited document that goes back to the client. And the same thing is true with a whole processing pipeline to get from those documents that we receive from our clients into a model that can edit. I'll start by saying that, when we first started Blackboiler, we were like, we made some assumptions that we found out were wrong. First assumption was that people are organized. They're just going to have this data in a repository and they just to us. That's not true. Our first couple of clients were like that, but after a while we found out, not everybody is as organized as we wanted them to be. But to answer your question about amount of data to train, we don't need an exhaustive amount of data to train a system on how to edit. And I'll tell you that that's because language in contracts is very constrained. We actually did some research very early on about kind of the linguistic characteristics of language in contracts. And all language follows what's known as Zipf-ian distribution. So if you take a log plot, it'll be like a -1/1 slope going down. Contract data does not follow Zipf-ian distribution. So what that means is that there's not as much variety in the language as there is in natural, what we call natural language. So the amount of data you need to train is to basically get to the point where you've seen a lot of examples, the number of examples you want to use. And you all know that. I mean, if anybody in here reads a construction contract, I could say to you, tell me what your standard provision is for paid if paid language, and then you're going to start rattling off condition precedent, blah 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 blah, right? Everybody knows what that looks like, and it has very similar structure. So we don't need huge data for our editing models. Now, we have a couple different types of models in our text processing pipeline. We have editing models that are for how we're going to edit. And those things are basically, we label every single piece of data that comes in on client markups as three things. It's either acceptable, right? The text has either been acceptable, it's been rejected, or it's been revised. And then there's a fourth category, which is essentially, is there something that's required to be in this document that's missing? And so what we do is we basically take apart contracts from that we get from our clients, and we say, chunk it into sentences and paragraphs or whatever, and we can label it accept, reject, revise, or this was inserted into this document. And then what happens is when a new contract comes in, we can just look at that language and say, well, how did we treat this language just before? or similar language, semantically similar language. So that's our second model. We have a semantic similarity model. How similar is this language to what we've seen in the past, right? And then that will say, oh, it looks like these other things that we've done before. And then we say, well, do we accept that? Do we reject it? Or do we revise it? And then an accept and reject are just our binaries, right? It's like yes or no. You can put track changes code around text that should be rejected. And then anything that needs to be revised is a little bit more challenging. But if we can find similar structures in those sentences or those paragraphs, we can transfer the edits over. And then we also are able to identify commonly used phrases. So like defined terms like party names and all of those things, Hugh, that are repetitively used.
Mm-hmm.
So like you might, one contract, it might say like a subcontractor, another might say trade contractor, it might say, service provider, whatever the case may be. So we're able to figure those out. So that's like a third model we're talking about right there. We have a model for identifying defined terms. We put all of that back into kind of a track changes scenario, and we put that back in the Word document, send it in. And then for the fourth one, we have like things that are missing from that document. And so what we do is we identify in that group of contracts that we see, we get from the client, we identify things that they're commonly inserting. So a scenario might be, in construction, a lot of times people will insert on a retainage provision or something like that. They'll insert something that, maybe there's law in the state, like Oregon has new laws in the state about like how much retainage you could hold. And so after the retainage sentence, they'll insert something that says, you can't withhold any more retainage from us than, what is allowed for under the code, blah, blah, blah. And so we learn that that's being inserted. And then we can look and we can say, well, where did you insert this in other contracts? And we insert it in that same spot. And then other times what we do is we learn that like, oh, they're just always putting this after like the indemnification provision or the indemnification section. And so we learn, oh, go look for the indemnification section and just go insert this at the end because it's not already there. And so what that means is that we're able to kind of have another model which is about like another classification model. So if you think about like the different models we have, it's not just like a single model, it's like a whole processing pipeline. And I didn't even go into like the beginning steps of that pipeline because like there's a lot of other things in that pipeline that have nothing to do with AI.
Let's get to those. Yeah, let's get to those in a second, because you've just pointed out two things that I often am talking about, and this is this idea of a trade-off triangle. Everyone in professional services used to hearing budget, time, and quality. You have to give one of them up. Well, when it comes to AI, a rule of thumb is either make the problem smaller, get more data, or have less accuracy. Those are the three things that you're looking at. And what I heard you do a few times is the first thing you did, at least let's just say it was the first thing you did, was understand the ground truth and you realized that actually the problem already isn't that big, because we're not talking about English in the wild. We're talking about English that is already has some patterns and constraints and how often people use certain words and so on. That was point one is, and the reason I call that out is for folks that are considering either consuming someone else's AI or growing it internally or some hybrid. The first thing to think about is try to do a survey of what you're looking to work on, to operate on, whether it's RFIs or it's legal documents or specs or so on. That's really important. And I think people underestimate how it's even worth building a little bit of code, not a whole lot, but this is the kind of thing where an AWS, configuration to just kind of churn through some documents at some level of scale so you can see what's in there. But the other thing you talked about is you don't have one model to rule them all, because again, you're saying that's too big for one model. I'd need more data than I could ever do. I tell an example where Google a couple of years ago published, that's the last time I've seen the number, that they had like 5,000 models in production. Now they don't have 5,000 products, but they do what you did, which is break the problem down so that any individual model isn't that big and complicated. So you don't need quite so much data for what that little model does. Instead, you think of it as a tool chain where this model will handle this part, and then it can either pass it off or however the flow goes. So I think that's an important one too, because when you think about AI, it is so often talked about as an abstract thing that you're going to do, as if it's only one, as opposed to, part of the design of your product is, and your solution is, how many models do we think we need? You're not going to know that right away, but you can at least begin thinking like that, so you don't have to get millions and millions of data points, which I thought was a really interesting point you brought up as well, is that you didn't need, millions of tagged data points. You could get going. And again, I'll bet in the beginning the accuracy was on its way somewhere, as opposed to, okay, we've nailed this. And then as you operated more and more, you get more and more accurate.
Yeah, I mean, we always tell our clients that, like any data problem, more data is better. But it's got to be good data. Like, don't give us bad stuff. Like, but yeah, we on the data side, we spent a decent amount of time understanding the problem. We have 15 patents in the space of automated contract markup, and we spent 2 years in R&D making sure we understood the problem and how to do this. Automated editing is very difficult. It's very difficult to do consistently. It's very difficult to do in a way that is configurable to a client and doesn't hallucinate or make just crazy mistakes. And so exactly what you said, we have a text processing pipeline because we know that the market is going to continue to change, and it's going to continue to produce new and better ways to handle data. And so what we want is a processing pipeline that is, we can swap out a component piece for a new component piece as soon as we figure out that we've got something that works better. So, we started out with some of our models being some stuff that came out in like 2016, 2017. It was published by like Facebook and those groups. And now we're using, for some of our classification stuff, we use large language models. It's not generative stuff, but it's LLMs. Because we were able to figure out that, along this step, we get superior results. So one of the things you have to be able to do when you're looking at that text processing pipeline or any step in this process is understand what you're trying to do in that step, test that step by itself, be able to come up with how well you're doing in any step in the process. So with us, it's like classification. We come up with we use a standard F1 score, which is, harmonic mean of precision and recall. And then we test it by itself. And we say, okay, we did better. Let's now go test it in production, because like sometimes where your two components meet, you might figure out that like, even though I stand alone, it does better in production, it does worse. And so like an example of that is we use a tool called Spacey, which does a bunch of different things like part of speech tagging. It'll like say like, this is a verb, this is a noun, and it does like sentence tokenization, dividing things up into sentences. Spacey, when we started using it, was state of the art at sentence tokenization, but it was a probabilistic model for sentence tokenization. And there's another older product on the market that's been around for a long time called NLTK that does sentence tokenization too. And it's not as good, but it's not probabilistic. And what that meant was we knew when it would be wrong. Whereas with like the probabilistic models, it became more difficult to predict when it was going to be wrong. And so, the second best thing that we find to being right is knowing when you're wrong. Because if you know when you're wrong, you can figure out a way to fix it. Whereas like it's more difficult to figure out how to fix something that you don't know when it's going to be wrong or why it's going to be wrong. So
and let me stop you. Let me stop you there, because that's an important point I want to pull out, and that is that I mentioned accuracy as one of the three parts of this little trade-off triangle. And one of the issues with AI is that we don't know when it's going to be wrong. It fails in ways that humans wouldn't necessarily do so. And I think that speaks to the human in the loop question. So as this is applied and really used, because a lot of folks are joining this because we're talking about workflows as much as the tech that enables them. How do your customers typically use this? I'm assuming it's not, okay, well, Blackboiler's got it. Let's go get a beer.
Yeah. No, we don't do that. We always tell people that Blackboiler is human in the loop technology. I think uh stepping back a second, I'll dive into this point. I think the biggest unknown and kind of the biggest breakthroughs in I don't think are going to have or I don't think are going to be around like improvements moving forward. I think it's going to be around people figuring out the psychology of the people interacting with AI. Like that's like the harder nut to crack, I think, in a lot of ways. So, you know, you can have the best AI in the world, but nobody uses it. It's not worth anything. So, what we've found in terms of selling the product is number one, we always tell people, you know, Blackboiler is not, you know, it's not magic. It's a tool. It's going to make you more efficient. Uh, it's going to replace that repetitive work. But we've also found that we don't want to have to change everybody's behavior, right? We don't want to have to make every single person who's going to be a user of Blackboiler decide that they are going to use Blackboiler. We like to get plugged into workflows. So like we want to be in a scenario where before the person who's even going to review that contract gets their hands on that contract, um, it's been reviewed and marked up by Blackboiler and it's sent to them. So then it's like they're getting that product, they get the contract, they review and edit it, and then it's done, and then it automatically goes into like our machine learning loops. That is where we get the biggest uptake is right there. It's like getting people to just be plugged into a system, and Blackboiler is part of that system already. We have some extraordinary results with folks who do that. I remember when I first started selling Blackboiler, I was on a podcast, not unlike this one, and I was on there with a legal operations consultant who I think the world of her. She's super smart, and I had never sold before. And I remember getting on there, and you know, somebody asked the question like, if you have never implemented, you know, you're starting from scratch and you're starting your legal operations function within your organization, like, what's the first thing you're going to tell people that they should go buy, or the first project that they should tackle? And I was like, you know, oh, you got to tackle contracting because it's like it's the biggest pain point. And she was like, I would tackle she's like, the first two things I would do is intake and workflow. And intake is just like what are we working on within the legal department, having that documented. And the second was, you know, having workflow tools that allow the business units to interact directly with legal in a way that is kind of automated. Like, you know, here's a contract, I need you to review it, these are the parties, and then it like goes into a queue and people pick it up and do the work, and then once they're done it goes back. And like those are tools like ServiceNow and Brighter, and you probably know some other ones. And at first I was like, oh, I wish she wouldn't have said that. And now I'm like, if somebody tells me they have workflow and intake, I'm like, awesome. This is going to be a great conversation, because like you're ready to take that next step to using AI to make your processes more efficient. You already have the things in place that we're looking for. You know, if you have workflow in place, that means you're probably reporting on like SLAs, internal SLAs, how long it's taking you to do something, how much of it you're doing. So you know you're inefficient. And when Blackboiler gets plugged into that process, we're not changing everybody's working habits. And then we can also measure automatically ROI. So like that's huge for us. I think that we cannot make people we cannot have everybody who's going to use AI have to decide they want to use AI. And that's we're like, we need to force it on them. Like and it needs to be in that workflow, or it needs to be operating in the background, and they need to just be getting it, because you're often changing the job of the person you're working with, right? So I give the example of reviewing and marking up contracts. The job of the person before Blackboiler was they get the contract in, they read through every single line, they review it and mark it up. You're a frontline worker, you're a production worker. When you go to working with Blackboiler, you're actually changing your job from a production worker to a manager.
Hmm.
you're now managing an AI. And so like, you'll get things like, well, it made some mistakes here, or it put this in the wrong place, or you'll get that feedback. And that's because AI is not perfect, but humans aren't perfect either, right? Our biggest client that we've worked with, um, they actually gave us 400 documents that they had reviewed and marked up ahead of time, and we went through those 400 documents and we measured how closely they came to hitting their standards.
Hmm.
So we had F1 scores on, did they make the right edit?
Yeah.
Did they miss it? We had it. And then we could measure against how well Blackboiler did. And then we could measure on how well Blackboiler with the human did. And I'll tell you, Blackboiler with the human is like, it's like hugely better. It's like massively better than the person by themselves. But you still get complaints from the human saying, hey, look, the machine did something wrong, right? The machine did this wrong. I wouldn't have done this wrong. But that's because humans don't, like, people don't know when they make mistakes. People don't make mistakes on purpose,
Yeah.
right? But it's
And
really
it's an
easy.
absence of a negative too,
Right,
Like you're
exactly.
saying, I haven't made the
Yeah,
mistake yet, so I'm sure I wouldn't have made it. That's
right.
interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And so all of those things, I mean, it's a very long-winded answer to your question, but like, how do
All
we
right.
sell it? It's human in the loop. But we don't want the human to make the decision every single time that they're going to use Blackboiler. We want to be plugged into that and into that pipeline.
Very often though, you're changing their job, but you're pulling away a lot of the stuff people hate doing anyway. And I think there's an interesting point to be made about what AI is good at and what humans are good at. And
Mm,
what you basically said is you're turning the human from the first person to or the first entity to process something to someone who's processing exceptions, which is another word for part of what a manager does anyway,
yep.
is reviewing things with context and knowing things that a trained AI probably couldn't know about, at least some of the time. A human will see implications that they just know, and there's no way you could have trained a model for that. That's one of the benefits of a human is we see a bigger picture than AI, but we're inconsistent and again having scored 400 of something, you can just imagine what the variability was. So I'm
Yeah.
assuming that's some of what people say as you're talking about workflows and you're talking about the real benefit in real jobs is we get a lot more productivity out of people. We get a lot more, we're able to tighten up the variability of output so that our risk almost by definition goes down. Are these some of the things you're starting to hear?
Yeah, that's exactly what we hear. We can't automatically measure for variability now, but we do it on like a human audit level, and we can go in and tell people like, hey, like before we call it an edit F1. Your edit F1 on this rule was 0.76. Now you're at 0.89, right? And your cycle time for getting this through the legal department or through the contracting department before was, I don't know, 48 hours, you're down to 24 or something like that. And so like having being equipped with that is what overcomes any sort of hurdle in people saying, well, it's not perfect, because it's not going to be perfect. It's just
Yeah.
not,
Well, the world's too variable. I mean, that's
yeah,
why we don't have self-driving cars like we thought we might, because
yeah,
even with billions and billions of dollars, the world's just a little too messy.
yeah. I think the other thing to hit on the other point that you were that you that you brought up is that we also tell people that like Blackboiler is not gonna, like, right now Blackboiler doesn't understand anything outside the four corners of the document, right? So like if you're negotiating a contract with uh somebody you've negotiated contracts with a lot before, and maybe that's a bad example because we actually remember what you've negotiated, but maybe you're negotiating a contract for the first time with a client who has a bad reputation, right? Like you've heard that this client, is difficult to deal with. So maybe you're going to negotiate that contract a little bit differently. Well, Blackboiler is not going to know that, right? By just
Mhm.
looking at that document, or it might not know that this is a really important project for you because this client's going to have a much bigger project down the road, so you want to appear to be easy to work with, and so we're going to not take as heavy a hand on the contract negotiation. Like those aren't things, those are where the human in the loop is really important, right? Like those are human level considerations to make, not something that's going to be made by Blackboiler.
And that's a general point about any AI, at least within a time frame we anyone here cares about, is that it doesn't have the ability to pick up on context the way a human does. I mean, the social instincts and social kind of wiring that we have is not what AI is built for. But in contrast, AI it's math, so everything it does is way more measured and so on. Can we switch gears real quick though and talk a
Sure.
little bit about how, like specific examples, not really companies, but how are people using it? Like you and I have talked, one thing you mentioned, for example, is subcontractors almost by definition have smaller contracts, so they got a lot of them, and it's
Yeah.
really, really hard for them to get their arms around, five contract, whatever the number is a day. I want to talk a little bit about areas where you see a lot of use.
Yeah. So in the subcontracting space, we have some subcontractors who are massive enterprise organizations, right? Doing, tons of work. But we also have smaller contractors. What's interesting in the smaller contractor space is that often the contracts are being reviewed and marked up by non-attorneys, right? So they're being done by somebody in the risk department. It might be somebody in pre-construction, and it might be somebody in the executive suite. And there's a whole lot of lack of consistency, or you have a distributed team that's able to do everything, like mark up those contracts, but what you want is to have some centralized oversight. So we provide that centralized oversight oftentimes, and sometimes our clients, so we have a partnership with the American Subcontractors Association, they'll say, I just want to know everything that like the ASA negotiation guidelines would call out about this agreement. And we might not agree to all those things. We might take them out, but I want to know what would be, what we would they would take issue with. And so we'll put that in there with our contractors. Some people want to do audits too, Hugh. Like they want to look at their signed agreements and understand how well they've done at mitigating that potential risk, which is a really interesting issue. There are some spaces now, not in construction, but there are some spaces in the financial place where you actually have to have a documented contracting process for mitigating risk. So having something like Blackboiler saying, hey, we've run this through, we've trained it on these rules. So not only are we having a human on it, but we also have a machine looking at it. This is our documented contracting process with a checklist inside of Blackboiler where they can say, yes, I've looked at this, and this, we're good to go. So that's it. And then outside of contracting, some of the most interesting things that we've done is, we have one client who, for their low risk contracts, they've decided that they only have 7 key risks, right? And those key risks are not, they're things that are administratively burdensome to deal with, right? They're not it's a huge company. They have 700,000 employees, and they are we can't have a non-solicitation provision because we're going to solicit people just by mistake, it's just type of stuff like that. And so if there's none of those 7 key risks in that document, we just send it back to the business user. Business users send them into Blackboiler via routing. So they have a workflow tool. They go to that workflow tool. They say, I have this, and this. It goes into Blackboiler. We'll read that information that comes from them, so we know what geographical location they're in, because they have different rules based on geographical location. We process that document. If we don't find any key risks, we just send it back to them and say, you can sign this, right? And if there is a key risk, we send it to their global legal team to review and make sure what Blackboiler did was right. And then it automatically gets routed back once they're done looking at it. We've taken 55-60% of these documents out of being looked at by a legal department. And because we have such great data, this is the group that gave us the 400 contracts ahead of time. We have such great data on how they were doing before that we periodically measure how we're doing. And the legal department's like, look, we don't care if there are mistakes, just as long as you're close to where we were before. right? Like just make sure we're doing better than we were doing before, and we'll keep going because this is faster. Our clients are happier because they're getting contracts reviewed and edited faster. And they look easier to work with. The legal team is doing less of this kind of low kind of impact work. Yeah.
And that speaks, I think, to one of the reasons we're even having this conversation is what's the role that AI right now can play in real workflows. And you hear this a lot, but there's some real concrete examples you just gave, which is it'll go through 10, 20 pages and pull out the 15, 5, whatever the 7 in one case, things that you should review. And it'll double check all the other stuff, that there's no surprises.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, lawyers will often say the indemnification clause is where danger hides, depending on the contract. But the point I'm making is that's a general point with where AI can help is abstracting big documents or big collections of things and going through all the stuff that your eyes would have glazed over and just highlighting the things that need a human to review. I think that's really interesting because it speaks to we're not naturally good as humans at keeping the attention over hours of looking at the same thing, which is exactly what AI is wonderful at. There's another point you brought up. So that's kind of item number one that I think is worth pulling out. But the other one that you talked about, and I think we're going to see more of this over time, is because it isn't a human you're paying effectively by the hour, even if it's salary, a human with finite, time and attention, you can actually point an AI, whether it's Blackboiler or the link or others, at documents that aren't currently urgent, but you want to go look at, either to tighten them up, find risks that you missed, whatever the reason is. There's an opportunity for companies to say, we've got terabytes of stuff that is either possibly a risk or valuable information, and let's go pull data out of it we can train models with. So the idea that AI doesn't have to only be in an active project is something that you're the first person that I've heard talk about it, kind of actively. But I think that's a huge opportunity because unfortunately they're usually not in one big database. They're usually on a collection of F drives and all over the place. But with not so much effort, you can pull a lot of that stuff into one place. It's what kind of data lakes are even for. But the idea that AI can automatically overnight or just in the background start to take the messy PDFs and turn them into something that's useful and or isn't hiding less risk, is I think really powerful and something that is a genuinely new workflow. It isn't something that people can pay to do. So you wouldn't say, hey, let's hire an extra 5 PEs and have them run around and do stuff. You just wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I think.
What do you think?
I think you're getting at like the point too of like kind of where I think the huge value in generative AI is, and kind of some of like, maybe this isn't the only place where generative AI has huge value. There's huge value everywhere, but I talk to people a lot about like, well, we have this text processing pipeline. We have these components. We swap them in and out. We are actively experimenting with, can we get prompt-based editing to do better job of editing than we currently have? And we haven't gotten to the point where we're like, it's more consistent and like make less mistakes, all this stuff, but it'll get there. We know it will, and we're going to swap it out. But one of the places where I think like prompt-based, like the generative AI is amazing is number one, you can get to a prototype extremely fast with generative AI. And it might not be the final solution. It might not be the best solution, but you can prototype something really, really quickly. And the second thing is like, think of the scenario that I've been using lately is like 2020 and the world shuts down and all of a sudden everybody needs to know if there's a pandemic exclusion in their contracts, right? So like your options were to like go train a bunch of models. Your options at that point were like, go look at all your documents and look through them by hand, which if you're a certain size organization, that's just unrealistic. Train a traditional AI model on the pandemic exclusions, which is probably going to take a couple of weeks to get that done at a minimum. And then if you had generative AI, you could just put that, like you said, in this big data lake and then been like Google, like, like just searched against it with generative AI as their pandemic exclusion. And that would have been earth shattering for somebody to be able to do that, right? Like to be able to say like, I now have a handle on, all of these contracts that have or don't have these pandemic exclusions, that would have been massively, you know, more efficient for people. That was, you know, those types of things that we can do with generative AI are like really, really powerful that you couldn't have done before, that you're able to do now. And I think those are like in contracting, that's like one of the main places where like the generative stuff will work better in the long run, are these ad hoc projects that you need, that you just like, you know, you can't go buy a product off the shelf and figure it out. You're not going to go train a model, but like I can get, you know, 85% of the way there with the generative, something that's generative.
That's an interesting point you get to again, which is the trade-off between accuracy and you know, problem size and model, and data amount. Really interesting. I want to switch gears one more time, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Sure.
One of the points that we brought up earlier is there's at least two types of model that you've discussed. One of them is sort of, you know, classic. I say classic; it's 10 years old, but deep learning, and then generative AI is something that you're using some of and see a real opportunity as you just the models get better and our handle on it. But you know, the pipeline you talked about, at least some of it isn't. And I think there's an important point to make here is that, you know, there's a lot of power in generative AI. There's still a little bit of risk and variability. There's a lot of power in deep learning, but you know, your data can be biased, in which case it's going to tend towards one answer versus another. And it's really hard to get that right until you've done it a lot.
Yep.
But sometimes you can get most of what you need done with simpler things. We talked about regular expressions, which are known as regex, and that's just a way of basically filtering for certain words. Let's talk a little bit about how, I mean, you said something interesting about how your CTO is like, let's start with the dumbest thing first. And you probably didn't use that word, but, and that makes a ton of sense in life, right? Is why go for the magic tricks when you can get something done really simply? And I think that's an important point to remember, is that things that might look like AI sometimes aren't. Sometimes it's just regex, or again, regular expressions, or it's rules, or it's so on. In fact, AI in the 80s was a bunch of rules. It kind of failed because you can't handle nuance, but nevertheless, you can get a lot done, especially when it comes to documents.
Yeah, I think that also talks a little bit about like knowing your data, right?
Yeah.
If you know your data and the problem, you're going to know what tools to use, and you know, have a better idea of what's going to work well. We at Blackboiler, you know, our text processing pipeline, like I said, there's a lot of steps in it. And some of that stuff is exactly like you said, it's like a regex, or it could be like a data cleaning step that, like, you know, we're not using AI, we're using like
Python.
Something commonly used tools to clean the data, or data extraction tools, or, you know, we use a regex for things like identifying list structures within our documents sometimes, because those are important to understand. And then again, we use the simplest thing that works well, right? We're going to use the simplest thing that works well. And then if we find out that there's something that's more complex that works better, that gives us better performance, we go into that. So we use all sorts of things. We use regex. We use some stuff that we have a PhD in computational linguistics on our team. He does some stuff with on like discourse and like figuring out like, you know, his PhD was in like figuring out like what we call slots, like, or like, you know, this word is filling this role in this sentence. So it's like, you know, this stuff like I was talking about, like the subcontractor, trade contractor. Oh, like this phrase here is being used like the term subcontractor is in every other contract, right? So that's probably who they're referring to as a subcontractor. So we have all of these different tools in there. A lot of it's simple. And, you know, our CTO also says that, like, you know, it's only AI until it works, and then it's just another tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're just, you know, we want to make everything a tool in the toolbox so that works well, and is predictable. But it comes back down to, like, here we talked a lot about like knowing your data. Like, we work with contracts, and if you get outside of like form agreements, like, you know, like the AIA does, or FIDIC, or any of these, you know, AGC has one, you know, like contracts don't come in standard structures. They don't have standard sections that, that it's not like everybody uses the same number formatting, or everybody uses the aggregate liability cap might be in numerous different places in that contract. What's incredible about the specification space that you're in is how structured that data is. Like, I can be on any project in the US and I'll know where I need to go in my specifications to go look at for doors, frames, and hardware, right? If we could do that same thing in contracting, it would be a total game changer in what you could do for the automated review and editing of contracts.
If only.
If only, yeah. But
Yeah.
get a bunch of lawyers. The one thing is, you could probably get a bunch of engineers to agree on like a standard structure. Getting a bunch of lawyers to agree on that it's probably a little bit.
What is it?
Tougher challenge.
You get 3 lawyers and 4 opinions.
Yeah,
Well, that's really interesting. And I think on another session, we'll talk about ontologies and how to take some of that mapping and do some fun stuff with it. For now, I'd love to open it up. We've got about 10 minutes in the first hour, and then we've got some time after that if we want. I'd like to open it up to any questions that the folks that are left might have. Okay. Well, we'll keep talking for a minute. That's okay. We'll keep talking for a minute and then maybe close it out at the top of the hour.
I'll say no questions, Hugh, but Daniel, great content. I'm taking great notes and I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, John. Well, when you think about how so John is with Dome Construction. When you think about then how a general contractor would walk through a little bit of what kind of how it's tended to be used. Is it, you mentioned before that, at least, or I don't think that was a contractor you were talking about, where they'd like for certain things to not even be in the legal department. Like if possible, as long as a couple of conditions are met, it's just the business person, which would be a PM or someone like that. Do you find that in contractors as well? Because it sounded like that was more of a okay.
No,
talk a little bit about how that tends to work. Yeah,
find it in contractors a lot. There's a couple of unique things I talked about with contractors. Number one is that you're always signing counterparty paper. The other thing that's unique in contracting is how often you're signing like a very similar document to something you've signed before, particularly at big organizations. Like you might, if you're a big civil engineering firm, you might sign the same form agreement with the state highway department like 3 or 4 times a year, right? Like, so one of the things we do is we actually just remember what you've done in the past. And that's really powerful because then like if a document comes in and your project manager out in the field is responsible for negotiating that contract, or your senior project manager is, well, at least they have a resource that says, this is how we did this previously, right? Like this is what somebody else in the team did, right? Or this is what the lawyer did when they reviewed this contract last year, or something very similar to this. So that's like one of the most powerful places we work with and with contractors. It's just literally having precedent for them, because some of our contractor clients will do like up to 40% of the work is repeat clients.
Yeah.
So there's that. We have some people we're in discussions with right now are like, they'll do like 5,000 agreements a year or something like that. And their legal team is like 5 people. And they're like, we can't actually put eyes on we can't actually have lawyers put eyes on every single contract. So anything below $500,000, like the PMs are responsible for reviewing, but we want to maintain control of at least these key risks that are being reviewed. And we want to make sure Blackboiler takes a look at those key risks and tries to remediate those key risks for us.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. How do you?
A couple of things about Blackboiler though. Oh, so here's 2 other unique things we can do. We actually create compliance plans for some of our contractors too, with the FAR and DFAR plans, FAR provisions that come in. Some contractors are required to have compliance plans every project. We can do that because we can read through, figure out what's in there, and then generate that compliance plan. But we also can generate, because so often you are negotiating contracts in PDF or we can generate like an addendum to that PDF, an addendum contract, not just doing the red line editing, but saying like, here's your addendum to this contract. This is what we suggest, the revisions you suggest you make. So that's another way people are using it, is just with the addendum generation here.
And a lot of that seems like you're just sort of being systematic about some of what the other functions are. I guess the final thing I'd say is about risk that using Blackboiler doesn't create but might. And we talked about human in the loop. You know, one of the things you talked about is effectively, you know, because it's AI, and well, rephrase, because it's software, you can track a lot of what's happening and what the outputs and inputs and so on. So some of what you're doing, it sounds like, to reassure people that the risk is under control, is benchmarking it where possible against other things, either itself, because it's consistent over time, or against past behavior, which is, you know, obviously the best, because you can say, here's what you were doing and we're better than that. How much a part of the conversation is that? Because I think one of the big things that as a lawyer you'll get that not every software company does is, we can't create new risk, whether it's implied because you should have known better because you were using, you know, Procore or whatever, or explicit. You know what I mean? So being able to help contractors get their arms around what risk, what impact you're having on their risk by using your tool, I think it's a big deal.
Yeah. So we don't have any sort of like a way to see, you know, are we, you know, more profitable on a project that was negotiated using Blackboiler? Like that is like obviously where we'd love to go, is like, oh, well, like these are the things that actually matter. This is where people actually end up losing more money or making more money on a project. We don't have that insight. We'd love to have that insight, but we are able to show people kind of consistency over time, and then, you know, that could be correlated to results of an organization,
or risk. I mean, what I'm getting at is that there's not going to be surprises. Like, you're not going to get something through that you wouldn't have, and we can show you why, because we're tracking how things are going over time. And if you've looked at 2 of them, you can believe that the other 98 are going to be about like what you expect.
But yeah, that's what we're going to do. That's what we do with our other clients, is we actually say like, well, we don't put eyes on all of them, but we check, you know, 10% to make sure that we're falling within an acceptable risk threshold. I think that's actually a really important thing, is to quantify what is a successful project in AI early on. Because a lot of people are going to say, I'll know it when I see it.
Yeah.
But because their jobs are changing, like that, I know it when I see it, am I actually understanding if we're doing a better job, or am I just commenting on the fact that my job has changed and it feels different?
Yeah. And how are you going to know what it looks like? Because it's different enough. I think this idea of benchmarking what success is harder to do than it sounds. And
It's really
it starts with what level of accuracy. So again, I come back to thinking about data accuracy and problem size, just because it's an easy thing to remember. But if you're okay with 85% accuracy because it's just spitting out things that are obviously, or rejecting things that are obviously not right, and whatever comes through, the human can assess at that point. Things like that, you can see how it saves a ton of time without necessarily creating new risk, as opposed to ever hoping that it would be 98%, because the data requirements, no matter what you're doing, get crazy when you get up closer to 100%.
Yep.
Hey, Dan, this has been fantastic. I'm going to open it up one more time for questions. If not, we're at the top of the hour, and I think this has been a great conversation.